Well, I would like to begin by thanking Dr. Segal for inviting me. I am highly honored to be here. I would also like to thank all of you, members of the audience, for taking time off your very, very busy schedule to join us in this matter, which is very, very important for the entire world, especially for Nigerians, not only U.S. national security, and I'm emphasizing what we're doing here is to provide information, and this is my personal emphasis, not only to serve U.S. national interest, but also to help Nigerians, which I believe is part of United States national interest in this matter. Let me begin by giving you a one-paragraph summary of Boko Haram. Boko Haram, which refers to itself as Jama'atul Ahl Sunnah Lidi Iwatul wa Jihad, translated, group of the Sunni people for the calling, which is calling to Islam proselytization, and for jihad. This organization was formed in 2002, as far as we have the current record. 2009, the founder, Muhammad Yusuf, decided with his group to take over a portion of Borno State and turn it into an Islamic state. Of course, the Nigerian military, which unfortunately has, even up to now, not been well trained to deal with this kind of matters, became involved, and we have the death of over 800 people. The Nigerian press has emphasized that these 800 people were all members of the organization, but we also do know when one reads the details that it is way beyond members. In fact, it engulfed private citizens who had nothing to do with the organization. This is not to blame the Nigerian military, but it is to add an appendage to our discussion that the Nigerian military or Nigerian security system itself needs fundamental reform. Because some of the violence that we see in Nigeria could easily have been suppressed without the amount of violence that occasionally come also from the police. What I've been asked to do is to give us a background, a very quick historical background, to the rise of some of these radical Muslims, not only in Nigeria, but in West Africa. Just a personal note here. I often tell my Nigerian friends that I know Nigeria more than many Nigerians, because Nigerians don't tend to travel from their regions. They tend to be localized. I had the fortune of, as a student in high school, touring Nigeria from the south, taking the train. This was in 1980, before many of us here were born. Taking the train, a very difficult ride from Lagos, Professor Padden would remember this, from Lagos all the way to Kaduna, and then taking the bus to Sokoto, and then from Sokoto to Maiduguri, across Lake Chad to northern Cameroon. I also had a fortune when I was doing my undergrad. I earned a scholarship from UNDP to work on ECOWAS. I was writing my master's thesis on the free movement of people and goods in ECOWAS in the West African sub-region, and I had the fortune of being sponsored to live in Nigeria for 1 whole year. I had that fortune. I'm a practicing Muslim. My parents were Muslims, and I lived among Igbos at the University of Nigeria in Nsukka for a whole year. That experience led me to understand that religious dynamics are very, very complex. I did not intend at that time to pursue a degree in the history of Islam. It came by accident, and I'm very happy to have pursued that aspect of history. I also have had the fortune of being born a Muslim, went to a Presbyterian primary school, an Anglican middle school, and a Catholic secondary school. Very few people have had this blessing. And in the course of all these experiences, I happened to be the only Muslim in these institutions. And I was treated very, very well. For that reason, it has always bothered me when I find Muslims and Christians clashing. And I tell them that I'm an epitome of Muslim-Christian dialogue. And I bring that dialogue to this conversation as well, because when I was living in Igbo land, in Nsukka, I also observed that Christian evangelists in the United States were in fact bringing a lot of money in that area and encouraging Christian proselytization. And there's nothing wrong with that. When I was doing my research of the rise and development of Wahhabi-inclined or Salafi movements, and I was asked, was Saudi Arabia and other Muslim countries sponsoring some of these groups? And I said, yes. It's no different. And when I look back, starting from the late 1970s, Africa was a fertile ground for both Christian and Muslim evangelism. It was coming from the East and the West. When one can even go back and look at the 1970s or immediately after independence, non-Muslims in West Africa, especially Christians, were going to the West to study. Muslims were going to the East to study. Most Muslims, especially those who lacked opportunities for Western education, went to the Arab world, studied in the Arab world, and returned. Let me give you a very quick scenario of Salafi movement and how that of Nigeria is different from other parts of West Africa. The Salafi movement began as early as 1930, and Professor Paddy knows Lassina Kaba's work, which traces the development of this movement to the 1930s, 1940s, and not in Nigeria, but in Mali. Its version emerged in Nigeria with the Yan Izala movement, starting from the late 1960s, but actually became stronger in the 1970s. 1970s was a pivotal moment for the development of radical Muslims. Radical, please underline that word radical, because we use and abuse this word. It's not really a bad word, but sometimes we equate radicalism with violence. These movements were radical in the sense of their dialogue, in the sense of their doctrinal differentiation against the Sufi brotherhoods. They were radical in terms of their discourse, not radical in terms of picking up arms and fighting. And that caveat, I think, is quite crucial. They very radically opposed the established Muslims, led often by Sufi brotherhood, these are Muslim mystical brotherhoods. They also argued against the established elite, whom they stress have always been exploiting other Muslims for their own benefits. They also introduced innovative Islamic educational system in the form of madrasa education by copying the models of secular schools. Madrasas or Islamic education now emphasized not rote learning, but also systematic process of acquiring Islamic knowledge. These groups were also radical in terms of their disengagement, not only with European colonialism, but also reinventing ways that they believe is modernity in their own ways. Modernity in terms of rejecting their elites who have refused to participate in national politics. In fact, the main leader of Yan Izala, Abubakar Gumi, was so politically charged. He began his career, of course, as a colonial, as an official in the colonial establishment. But he argued in 1983-84 during the election that Muslims who were denying their women of going out to vote were in fact depriving Northerners of political victory. Professor Padden, you remember this? When he said, "I siyasa tafi ibada," meaning politics is better than worshiping God. Could you believe this would come from someone who has spent his entire career arguing about the importance of Islam? And now he is saying politics is sometimes better than worship. What he was saying in context was that Hausa leaders were depriving their women of going out to vote, even though these women have been registered to vote. Because Hausa men had the tendency of confining their women. And he was arguing that if these women who have the right to go and vote and have been enfranchised to go and vote, stay home, the North is going to lose the election. And with this statement, which of course in the end will bring his career down, Hausa men allowed their women to go out and vote. So this is essentially the trajectories when one look across West Africa. This is the trajectory of the Salafi Wahhabi movement. The Salafi Wahhabi movement came with a doctrine that was not conducive to the local environment, and that was part of the reason why they declined in the 1990s, but they were locally constructed. They all, practically in every single region that one looks at, even across the West Africa to East Africa, most of these organizations emerged out of local doctrinal context. However, another caveat, when Arab money is available, I don't blame them for reaching out for it. And indeed, many of them did reach out for this money, not because the Arab world was giving them the money, but because they saw an opportunity and they reached out, they wrote letters about, we need this, we need to establish mosque, we need madrasa. They convinced Arab philanthropists to give them the money. In the same way that Christian leaders in Ghana, Burkina Faso, all over West Africa, also do reach out to Christian evangelists in the West to sponsor the activities. Muslims were doing the same thing. If we need to understand Muslim Christian conflict or Muslim radicalism, we also have to place it in context of this new space which many evangelists from the East and the West discover in Africa. And this new space of contestation, of course, is one of the reasons why Northern Nigeria has remained what it is. Boko Haram, translate Boko Haram, book or Western education is forbidden. And this statement, and that's what Boko Haram means, right? Western secular education is a bad thing. It's not acceptable in Islam. And this statement was made by Muhammad Yusuf, who himself was a Western secular educated guy, right? He has a background in Western education. It is not entirely surprising that one might find a situation in which someone with Western education might reject Western culture. There are two different things. Western education, Western cultures are not the same thing. And what Muhammad Yusuf was arguing was the extent to which, I think I have 10 more minutes, good. The extent to which Western culture, the infiltration of Western culture was destroying Northern Nigerian indigenous culture, especially the Islamic identity. This was the beginning of his movement. One might remember Said Qutb, who studied here in the United States, went back to Egypt, and in fact used his training in Western education to argue against Westernization of Egypt, right? Professor Paddy knows this better than I do, and I'm not going to embarrass myself by giving you the details. The point that I'm emphasizing here is that Nigeria is a unique case. Whenever I look at Nigeria, sometimes I hate reading the news from Nigeria because there is hardly good news from Nigeria, especially since the beginning of this millennium. There's hardly good news. But when one pays attention, very close attention, and one compares Nigeria with other parts of West Africa, we cannot deny the fact that Nigeria is it's a basket in itself. Why is this the case? There are a few points that I would like to highlight. Professor Padden has mentioned one of them. That is the historical base. The politicization of Islamic identity or religion in Nigeria, one can argue, began with the revolution of Ousman Danfodio. The revolution of Ousman Danfodio, which brought down the Hausa political oligarchy and replaced them with Muslim elites, became the foundation of the relationship between politics and religion in northern Nigeria. However, we also have to understand this is not a this is a fluid system. It's by no means rigid. I do remember in my reading when the British colonialists conquered northern Nigeria in 1902 and ended the Sokoto Caliphate, Sokoto leaders embraced the British. It was one young blind man who mobilized people. He was called Damakafo, the son of, Damakafo is someone who is blind, who mobilized forces, Muslims, to continue the struggle against British colonialism in 1905. His struggle, a blind guy, of course, promised his people, I will give you a charm that will protect you against European bullets, and was able to fight with his folks until he himself was overthrown and executed, was able to fight both the British in northern Nigeria and the French in what is today Niger for almost 2 years. That indeed brought an end to anything that resembles the the use of religion to struggle against the political establishment. Throughout the post-independent Nigeria, in fact, it was only starting from the late 1980s that Islam again came to the front of Nigerian politics. So religion and politics in Nigeria has a historical root that we cannot ignore. The Maitasini incident, which also began around Borno, was one other example of the use of religion in politics. I already gave you an example of this young Israeli leader who made a politically charged statement about religion, the relationship between religion and politics, and in fact leading to the demise of his own religious career, because it's controversial, and his enemies actually picked that up and lashed him until he came down. Religion is also very important in Nigerian politics, in northern Nigerian politics, because unlike in many other parts of West Africa, for a very long time, northern Nigeria admittedly was isolated from the south, and there were a lot of younger people who grew up not having any other social interaction with people besides Muslims. I do remember when I was in Nsukka, there were a number of northern Nigerians who came there and found that most of my friends were Christians, and they would ask me, why are your friends, all of your friends, Christians? And they see me in the mosque, so they couldn't say I've abandoned Islam. And they wondered, so I used the opportunity to tell them, in Ghana, Muslims and Christians react together. On Christmas Day, we celebrate Christmas with them, because as kids, we enjoy those candies that they distribute on Christmas Day. On the day of Salah, Eid Day, which we call Salah, we give them our food. That was good neighborliness, and for them, this was shocking, because that is not what they are used to. I often, recently, I think it was in 2007, I wrote a proposal to U.S. That bell is not familiar. I have 5 minutes. No. I wrote a proposal which I wonder to USAID. I didn't know where to send it. I mailed it to them. And I argue that one of the ways by which we can prevent, or we can at least ameliorate, some of the tensions in northern Nigeria, we don't have the money to reduce poverty. It's a very important factor, even though there are other places, as Professor Segal has mentioned to me one time, there are many places where people are poor and yet they don't use religion to instill violence. But I argue that northern Nigerian Muslims need to be exposed to other forms of knowledge, and not only northern Nigeria, but many of the Arabophone elites who had returned from their training in the Arab world have background in Arabic. Arabic is not the national language, it's not the language of political function, and do not have English or French background. These folks need to be integrated into the society. And one way we could integrate them into the society, and when we integrate them into the society, they would be the ones who would be explaining to their folks, this is a pluralistic society that must respect everyone else's religion. And my argument in that proposal was that USAID could provide stipend for some of these folks to take English and of English classes. My reference was in Ghana, to take English classes. Never heard anything from them. Now guess what? Saudi Arabia in 2011 agreed with the University of Ghana to establish a department for educating Arabophone elites. Those with Arabic would be given secular education, especially English language, and Saudi Arabia would pay the university for this service. And I think they are a bit ahead of us. We could also do the same thing. And I through my research, I understand and I believe this would help to reduce some of the tensions in northern Nigeria. Would help. It would not solve it. Because one other related factor in northern Nigeria, which is very fundamental, and we cannot ignore this, is poverty, is social dislocation. Now, northern Nigeria is particularly unique because the gap between the rich and the poor is so wide, and it is also integral to northern Nigerian culture. When they call, in northern Nigeria, when they call someone Den Talaka or Talakawa, right, the poor, when they call someone, or someone call themselves the poor, I'm a poor, there is nothing derogatory about it. It is known, it's acceptable that other people could be poor others could be reached. But what has happened in Nigeria in particular is the gap between the affluent and the poor. Not only the gap, but also the belief that we live in a very rich, wealthy society, and look at our condition. And sometimes these conditions tends to be expressed with religious factors. It is not, yeah, I have 2 more minutes. I'm looking at the time as well. One can look at other factors which influence people, right? Religion is not the only one. Some people would use ideology. We do remember the time when in many parts of Africa, when a politician needs to establish their own credentials, what do? They become communists, right? Or they claim to be socialists, right? Because they can use that to reach audience. Muhammad Yusuf, when he started preaching, when you go back and you look at his transcript, he was using this fundamental poverty and social dislocation in northern Nigeria to reach to his audience. He told them about how poor you are, how the wealthy is continuously becoming wealthy, how they frown upon you, how they look down upon you, how they claim to be Muslims but have become corrupt. So these elements are important. We can talk about any other issue, but I would argue very, very strongly that anyone who has lived in northern Nigeria would tell you this: the level of poverty is extremely important. And I would like to stop here. Some of the issues probably we'll be able to address through the questions and answers. Thank you very much for your attention. Appreciate it.